Don't worry, this is the last time you're going to see me up here, so I don't want you to get sick of me. But Joseph and JD did ask me to come up before our distinguished panel begins to just say a few more remarks about who I am, my background. In case some of you don't know, as JD just referred, I served nearly 25 years on the Hill as a chief of staff to my hometown congressman for 18 years, as well as staff director on 6 different subcommittees over my career, and I think I ended up serving with 8 different members of Congress, which is a pretty good long run. But when Joseph and JD started coming around to the Hill and I got to know them better and the work that SFS does, they provided countless amounts of information and white papers and served as expert witnesses and testified at many hearings that I was pleased to be a part of. And I really came to appreciate the work that they do and that SFS does. And when I retired after a long career, 25 years, beginning in the end of May of this year, they, in their infinite wisdom, offered me to come on board as part of their team, their growing team, as a senior fellow for congressional affairs. And I was proud to accept that. And one of the first things they did listen to me about with my advice was to honor Ileana Ros-Lehtinen with our first man-wearing award. And I hope you all agree that she was quite the worthy recipient. I'm pleased to call her a personal friend too, and in case you couldn't tell, there's a lot of affection there for her and her team. But going back a little bit more to why I joined, and we're pleased to have this distinguished panel here, and I'll wrap up my remarks by just saying that we all, I think, who've gathered here today understand the importance of the Western Hemisphere and the issues that are critical here to our futures. I have 2 little girls who are half Thai, and they expect to travel the world, and they already have probably as much as I had before I joined the Foreign Affairs Committee all those years ago. But I wanted to let you know how important I feel the region is. I've traveled to every part of the, well, most of the world, but certainly having served as the staff director for 8 different members and 4 different chairmen on the Western Hemisphere. I met a lot of presidents along the line, led several delegations, vice presidents, foreign ministers, business leaders in the communities that we all care so much about, and human rights groups and NGO activists. And I know personally, and I take it to heart, about this region and the importance it serves to all of us. It often does, as Joseph alluded to, get short shrift, and I'm going to do my part as part of SFS's team to make sure that that is no longer the case. So with that, I'm going to do my part to help them expose their work on Capitol Hill a little bit more broadly over the next several years. And I'm humble and pleased that they felt the need to bring me on board to help expand our reach on the Hill. That's one of the reasons why we're all here today, obviously. So with that, I will turn it over to Pablo, and we'll look forward to hearing from our first distinguished panel of experts, except for Steve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, JD and Joseph, for inviting me, and thank you, Roger, Steve, and Rebecca, for being here. So I'm going to try to do this panel very dynamic. So let's start with a general question. What would you consider to be the 2 main strategic threats in the continent right now? Starting with Rebecca, please. Ladies first.
Okay.
And why?
So,
and
okay,
why,
why?
obviously.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Joseph for putting this together, and I also want to thank my dear friend Alex Chafwen, who has supported my work for many years, including my early work on the rule of law. So thank you both for having us, and also I just want to say how wonderful it is to be on a panel with my 2 successors and dear friends.
Predecessors.
Predecessors, you're right.
But we're
That's
not
right, I had a lot of cleaning up to do.
We're not
That's
deceased
confusing. No, actually, one of the things that's quite remarkable, and Steve and I were just talking about this, is the fact that we, although we talk a lot about partisanship right now, but really the 3 of us worked on many of the same issues, and I would say that I continued very much along the same path that you both did. So thank you. So the question about challenges, and also the broader question about why we should care about the Western Hemisphere, especially when so much of the world is, as Joseph said, on fire, and there's so many migraines, and whereas in Latin America, I think we pretty much have headaches. I think you could argue that Venezuela is a migraine. But what I really want to point out is that because of the relative stability in the Western Hemisphere. Yes, there's some serious challenges, but there are also a lot of opportunities. And I'll focus my remarks on that, but as far as what I see as the major challenges, I think Venezuela clearly is one. And I think that other challenges, I know Steve is going to talk about the governance and economic challenges that are quite prevalent in our region. I think the undergoverned spaces, transnational organized crime, the endemic corruption, all of these also pose challenges to the relative stability and security of our hemisphere. And these could have the potential, they do have some potential to overwhelm some of our partners, therefore spreading the instability. If it's okay, I just want to say a little bit about a specific challenge, which I see as Mexico. And I think that that's a challenge that could be our own making. If we think about the opportunities in the region, I'd say one of the greatest ones is that we have very capable partners, and partners not just with the capacity to take on a greater security, share of the security burdens, but also the will to do so. Argentina was mentioned earlier. I know Joseph is doing some great work in Argentina. I think that's one example of a potential security exporter. Of course, we have Colombia, the work we do together in Central America with the U.S.-Colombia Action Plan. Chile is another close partner when it comes to security exporting, but Mexico is a really critical partner. And what worries me is that some of the rhetoric coming out of Washington, D.C., and certain policy positions, for example, on NAFTA, really we hear a lot about how this has the potential to undermine our cooperation, our political cooperation, and our economic cooperation with Mexico. But I would argue that it would also be really, really bad for the U.S. if it were to undermine our security and defense cooperation. And if those of you who are listening to Minister Videgaray on Saturday, when he actually alluded to this, he didn't just allude, he directly said that if there is a rejection or if we do scrap NAFTA, that could impact our security cooperation and also our cooperation on Central America. So I just want to highlight some of the areas where we're really working closely with Mexico, and where I think that this is a real challenge for us. So I think we're all familiar here with our counterterrorism, counter-narcotics cooperation. That's very important. When President Trump talked about the opioid crisis as a public health emergency, he also acknowledged that 90% of the heroin that's coming across the border is coming from Mexico. Former Assistant Secretary Brownfield said, it's actually 94%. And if we are going to focus on the supply side, or going to go to a supply side approach, this cooperation with the Mexican military is critical. As you all know, the Mexican military has the lead in the counter-narcotics mission, eradication of the poppies, and also, of course, fighting the cartels. So, that's something, and I just don't think we should cut off our nose to, what is the saying? Cut off the nose to spite the face. So there's one, and then also our cooperation on migration, and this is another policy priority of the Trump administration. I think one of the things that I was really happy with, and is that our cooperation with Mexico, our security cooperation, our defense cooperation went beyond the operational and the tactical. We started to talk more about strategic issues, including the challenges facing Central America. Mexico also shares the view that until we address the triple threat of poor governance, poverty, the economic variable, and also security, we're going to continue to face this migration challenge. It's not going to go away.
Rebecca, I'm
sorry,
sure we're going to go back to
coming
Mexico
out
in depth. What about if we go around and then go back to Mexico or to probably Venezuela? But very interesting. I'm sure we'll go back to this. Stephen?
Well, thank you very much, Paulo, and I really want to thank Joseph and JD for putting on this incredibly important and timely forum. The thing about hemispheric security that's really important to understand is that it is complex. It requires the combined efforts of many different forms or instruments of expressing power, diplomacy, intelligence, military, economic policy, as well as finances and some other things as well. And it really works best when there's a combined effort and all the different players can contribute to and support the efforts of each other. As well, it's important to recognize, I think, and maybe this is just my personal opinion, but you're more secure when you're able to have greater influence, and that means pushing your borders out. And that's something that comes from my background being in the Air Force. Apologies to the Army, Roger.
It's a fine alternative to the military.
But we do have good golf courses. But it's really important to expand those borders outward. And what do I mean by that? It's not actually having disputes with other countries and claiming territory, but it's making friends, alliances, striking coordinated relationships with different countries, so that the practices that you have or that we have as a democracy and a free country are practices that others begin to share. And there's been a long-term trajectory, and I think Rebecca alluded to this, because a lot of the policies that Roger was working on, I worked on, and then Rebecca worked on, and successive administrations continued all the way from Plan Colombia, which was in Roger's portfolio, handed it to me, then the Merida Initiative and CARSI and the beginnings of the Caribbean Basin, the Caribbean Security Initiative that the Obama administration continued. These things are very important, but all of them had one aspect in common, that they tended to push our borders out. Now, is that a bad thing for the United States to try to influence other countries and try to prepare the geopolitical battlefield, as it were, or the geopolitical environment in which we reside as a place that's much more friendly to us? No. It's exactly what we want to do. We don't want to fight hard wars. We don't want to fight situations that are beyond our ability to confront them and combat them in an effective way, and we do that best through alliances. If you don't do that, then what you end up doing is something that the old wagon trains used to do in the pioneers that were crossing our country during the times of Manifest Destiny, and that is they'd run into trouble. They'd just circle the wagons and try to, fight off whatever hostile forces there were to the best of their ability, and they usually lost, and their bones are scattered all over the Great Plains. Now, I don't think we want that to happen. It's not going to happen if we continue to engage our neighbors and have an influence. One of the biggest things that this country began, I think, in earnest in the 1970s, the beginnings of it, but really began in the 1980s in the Reagan administration, in the encouragement of democracy and good governance in the Western Hemisphere. We went from a hemisphere that was mainly filled, 2/3 of the country were dictatorships of one form or another, to a country where civilian elected leaders in all countries but one have become the norm. Now, they're not perfect democracies, and that's why the organization that I represent now, the International Republican Institute, exists along with its sister organization, the National Democratic Institute, to promote good governance and democracy and to try to deepen and consolidate those practices. But friends, in this room, we have very good allies and friends throughout the hemisphere, committed Democrats in neighboring countries like Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Colombia, Peru, Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and I think it's incumbent upon us to treat them as colleagues and work with them and help them consolidate that, because that's going to be one of the biggest defenses that we have, in, not to minimize the contribution of our military and their militaries, but it's going to be one of the biggest defenses that we have to push back against the creep of totalitarianism in our hemisphere and also in the world.
Thank you, Steve. Roger, please.
Thank you. And I'd like to give my little thanks and greetings, first of all, to Alex for being our El Padrino, all our wonderful guests, the many friends that I see here, our Santo Patron, Max Manwaring, who I gather we're going to see later on. I also want to thank having earned my living as a translator, I want to thank the translators. Is la traducción está buena? Okay. And technicians. So thank you all for that. You asked the question, what is the greatest threat to our hemisphere? And first of all, I agree profoundly with everything that you just heard from my colleagues here. I would focus it a little differently, and I want to say something. I'm going to give all my remarks today are going to be strictly from my personal point of view and trying to look at it from the point of view of the United States. So I want to make that clear in light of some things I'm going to say later. What do I think is the greatest threat to our hemisphere? Well, in many ways, it comes from within the hemisphere. But looking at it from our point of view, I think that one of the things that should give everyone hope for our hemisphere is that there is a remarkable degree of consensus here in Washington as to what the hemisphere means and what our approach to it should be. And it's a consensus based on the idea of freedom and democracy, and that when you give the people of Latin America the chance to freely decide their own destinies, sure, they make mistakes, as do we in this country. That's democracy. It's messy. We make mistakes. But in the long run, that is what works out best, and that is what is right. Rebecca alluded to, without using the dread word, bipartisanship. But to me, that has been the essence of American policy towards... I'm sorry about that. I hate these things. Okay. It has been, in fact, our secret weapon. You said that you worked on things that Steve and I worked on. Well, I must tell you that we worked on things that Pedro Pablo Permuy and folks from the Clinton administration and before, going back to Reagan, worked on. That's our secret weapon. So, what is the single greatest threat to the hemisphere? Who has
I think it's cell phone.
a bowl of water? Okay. It's SOCOM. They have my... Okay, I thought I turned it off, but what is the single greatest threat? Let me give a personal anecdote that might illustrate it. My mother is American. My father is from Costa Rica. My parents are down there. I was born in the United States, but I grew up in Costa Rica. I chose to come here and be an American, even though I was already an American citizen. But it was an act of choice to come here. So I am an immigrant, in effect. My mindset is that of an immigrant. And to tell the truth, I always felt a little strange in the United States because I didn't grow up here. I didn't watch TV. I didn't play American sports. None of that. I was always a little bit of an awkward fit until I joined the Army, I have to say, and actually wore the American flag on my shoulder. And then it doesn't matter how strange or awkward or different or special or embedded your connection to the country is. When you have that flag on the shoulder, you are an American, and you are part of the history. No one can take that away from you or question it. So I'm looking at it from this point of view, and I look back on Costa Rica, as I say, where I grew up. My family came to Costa Rica in 1831 from Colombia. When Colombia became independent, immediately a civil war broke out, and they had the presence of mind to leave. And they came to what was then the jungle. And in fact, much of it is still the jungle in the town of Limon in Costa Rica. And some of you may know it. They started a hardware store. There's a 4-story building in the middle of the jungle. There was absolutely nothing else there. It was called La Proveedora. And La Proveedora survived. It survived bankruptcies. It survived. Civil war. It survived corruption. It survived rebellions. It survived attempts to reestablish the slave trade. It survived fire. It survived several fires. It survived earthquakes. It survived several plagues. It survived hurricanes. The one thing it did not survive was lack of interest from the next generation. And it closed its doors after 160 years in I think 1991 it was. Lack of interest in the next generation is, I think, this here in this country is the single greatest threat from our point of view that this region faces. And to me, nothing illustrates the story better than they had one of these fantastic game shows on television, and they asked the contestant, the equator divides the world into how many hemispheres? And the contestant said, 3. Well, it is a sad commentary on our state of affairs that most people in the United States cannot even find their own state on a map, let alone a Latin American country. This lack of interest, this lack of understanding of a region that is vital to our past, essential to our present, and critical to our future, this is, I think, the single greatest threat that, from our point of view in the United States, that we face.
Let me ask you one question, Roger, and get the question for the rest of the panelists, and then go back to Mexico with Rebecca. We have Venezuela every single day almost in the headlines. You have obviously narco trafficking, you have Hezbollah, you have challenges to the economy, challenges to democracy. What would you advise President Trump to do? And second, is there anything that you foresee in the future that could precipitate an American intervention in Venezuela?
Who are you asking that?
First to you and then to the rest of the panel.
First of all, to answer the question, is there anything, you mean like a military intervention? No, I don't see anything. It's not called for. I can't imagine why. So no. But I am a conservative Republican. That means that I come from the non-pedophilia, non-criminal contempt of court, non-blatant corruption, non-money laundering, non-soon-to-be indicted on money laundering charges, etc., wing of the Republican Party. In other words, I come from the Republican wing of the Republican Party. Thank you. So I'm very concerned about this administration's ability to do anything right. I think it is. I think it is. And let me say, I tried to help. I provided a list of 20 outstanding people, all veterans that I thought would be excellent in this administration, and so forth. But I just think that the incompetence, the ignorance, the absolute inability to execute even the simplest things is the hallmark of this administration. So my advice to the Trump administration would be, please stay away. Please stay away. Don't mess this up. And it's not a joke, and here's why. I said the essence of our success in Latin America has been our bipartisanship. What do I mean by that? I served for 3 years in the southern front of the Nicaraguan resistance, the Contras. The southern front was the front that was based out of Costa Rica. It was in large measure composed of Mosquito Indians. My boss was Eden Pastora. I'm the only person who ever worked for Eden Pastora, Commander Zero, and Donald Rumsfeld. What I saw when I was with the Contras was that sometimes American aid to the Contras passed by 1 vote in the Congress, sometimes it failed by 1 vote, sometimes it passed by 2 votes, it just went back and forth. And this was a disaster. to move. We learned these lessons, I think, eventually out of that debacle and such. We learned the lessons of what bipartisanship means and what it can accomplish. One of the absolutely essential components of Plan Colombia was the fact that there was no doubt that no matter who became president, Plan Colombia would continue as it was, and perhaps even better, from Clinton and so forth. And I don't think this administration has that in its DNA. So I think that if they try to do anything, it will not work. That's my personal take on this.
Thank you, Roger. Stephen and Rebecca, do you have another take on the advice for Trump regarding Venezuela?
Well, one of the things that we face in Venezuela is the fact that it's on the verge of financial collapse. It's also a country that's trampled human rights and civil liberties of its citizens. There's a great deal of the great potential for instability in the country, and it's driving out refugees and people seeking asylum in other countries. The big impact right now is in Colombia, also felt in Panama, South Florida, and even to some extent in Guyana and in Brazil. But the danger is that it's going to, the problems in Venezuela, and specifically with a regime that tends to hang on, is that it's going to impact what's happening next door in Colombia with the peace process. The peace process is very precarious. It's not very well understood by the Colombian population. By way of some kind of necessity to keep negotiations secret, it was kind of rushed into place, and it failed a plebiscite to gain approval, and still managed to go ahead, but in doing that and meeting timetables not very well explained, and the result is that a lot of things have to happen and have to happen right for that process to go well. That said, you have the FARC, which is still very confrontational in Colombia, and has now announced plans to form a political wing or a political party in Venezuela, which had been its sort of center for rest and relaxation and rearmament. And so there's a potential for some of the, the not only geopolitical but also the military equation to turn against Colombia should an alliance like this take place. Now, the FARC said that it has handed in arms, but to the extent that has really happened, I think it's going to be hard to tell. We've seen this movie before, where guerrillas have said that they handed in arms, and then they turn up in all kinds of hideouts and places, and they end up in criminal hands and things like that. So it's a fluid situation. I would certainly counsel our government to keep a close eye on this situation, because the problems in Venezuela can easily spill over elsewhere. Another thing kind of related to Venezuela is Cuba, and the biological clock is ticking on Raul Castro, the lone brother that's representing the Castro family, and is there going to be a hardening of the regime by members of the military when he passes from the scene? Is there going to be a Havana Spring? Kind of doubtful that would happen. The other thing would be whether there would be a mass exodus. Again, something like what happened in 1994 and earlier in 1980 with the Mariel boat lift, with young people seeking to exit the island that offers them absolutely nothing. So these are things that I think we have to be very careful of. And again, the nexus is countries that have totalitarian or autocratic rule, and then propped up by extra hemispheric actors like China and Russia, who very much would like to see things much less stable in our neighborhood.
Thank you, Stephen. Rebecca?
So first of all, your point about the greatest threat, a show I recommend in New York, if you haven't seen it already, is John Leguizamo's new show. It's called Latino History for, I think it's called Latino History for Morons. Something along those lines, but it's basically he's addressing this question that his son knows nothing about Latin American history, and it's excellent and it's really funny. So I agree with both of you on when it comes to your comments on Venezuela. I think that we all are watching, with great sadness when we hear. I mean, I think everyone by now is familiar with the study that came out that talked about. It was an academic study that 75% of Venezuelans have lost weight, an average of 19 pounds or 20 pounds since 2014. And I think we see these images, and they're really tragic. I think we all were tracking Nikki Haley's she attempted to use the ARIA formula to sort of name and shame Maduro and his cohort. I think more naming and shaming it's not enough, but I think it's very important. Continuing to work with our Latin American partners, I think it says a lot. I know that we've been disappointed with the OAS, and of course this gets into the whole Petro-Caribe politics. But the Lima group, where you do have Argentina now taking a much stronger stand, and other southern cone countries and Mexico as well. I think that continues to be very important. I'm glad that you brought up Colombia. I think that the peace process, I agree, it's very precarious. I think another thing that really worries me looking at Colombia is sort of this idea, Uribe referred to it as the social recovery of the territory, or when he created that organization, SICAI, this idea of like, well, how is Colombia going to fund the social recovery of the territory? In the past, the military's gone in, and then the other agencies haven't followed. So I think until you have, real institutions and governance in some of these parts of Colombia where I have never seen them, I think that's something else we need to support and look out for. As you, I think, Roger mentioned the current administration, and I think this is why I'm particularly concerned about Mexico. Is just this is the one region or the one country that I think the administration has paid a lot of attention to, and I think it's been really bad that it has. I think if you're I agree. I hope that we stay out of the Trump administration doesn't pay a lot of attention to Venezuela.
Since you are an expert in Mexico, some people said that Mexico is basically a failed state. Do you agree with that or not? And what specific advice would you give President Trump as to what to do in Mexico with the different areas that you mentioned before?
So, first of all, I'm not an economist, but I think scrapping NAFTA is not smart for many reasons, including for the potential security implications. If the goal is to reduce a $63 billion trade deficit with Mexico, if that's possible, or if it's even desirable, is it worth it for everything that's at stake? Something I wanted to point out on the migration issue, Mexico has really been doing a lot of the dirty work of apprehensions for us. Mexico could stop. I think it's over 40% of the migrants from the Northern Triangle, from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador that are ultimately bound for the U.S. Mexico is responsible for over 40% of the apprehensions. That's a pretty big deal. It's a pretty significant number. And if Mexico would, we all remember the unaccompanied children crisis of 2014. It would have been a lot worse without Mexico's assistance. Really quickly, I think something else that we don't hear a lot about is Mexico. And when we think about external actors and kind of anti-Americanism in the countries of ALBA, Mexico has really stepped up to help support the Inter-American Defense System. Mexico is going to be hosting the 2018 Conference of Defense Ministers of the Americas. If you look at their presence in the Inter-American Defense Board, they went from 0 representatives to I think 25 in 2014 to 25 today. They have the presidency of the IADB. This is, I think, very much in our interest that Mexico continues to play that role. So I would say NAFTA kind of that's the closest thing on the horizon. We just started the 5th round of negotiations. I think some of these, some of the demands that we're making, or the sunset clause, the rules of origin, that are just not acceptable to Mexico or Canada. I think scrapping NAFTA is a real threat.
Let me follow up with one question regarding Mexico. How would you advise the Mexican government to lower the level of violence linked to the cartels?
Yeah.
Do you back aggressive stance against them? Not so much aggressive stance. What would you tell them?
I mean, that's the middle. I mean, I think the homicide rate now is the high. It's approaching to what it was, the highest in 20 years, and that's of course with the military playing, involved in internal security. I don't have a great answer to that question. What I would say is, meeting with General Cienfuegos and Admiral Soberon, they do not relish this role. They know that the longer that they're involved in this internal security mission, the more. We've already seen human rights abuses. There's an increase in reporting on human rights abuses, and the likelihood of corruption, and kind of the Mexican militaries. It's a very trusted institution in Mexico, but this concern that the longer that they're doing this, the more likely it is that they're going to run into problems. So that's obviously not an answer. It's more of a warning. And it's not, that actually is something I think we should be paying a lot of attention to when we look throughout the region, where you have the military really involved in law enforcement. I would say that there's really not another alternative in many cases, because the police are just not ready to step up. Either they're underfunded, they're corrupt. And so I think this idea of developing an off-ramp for the military, I think also in Central America, I would say, highlight this. It's really important to help develop an off-ramp for the military and get the police. So this is going to involve, and I think this is something that was really strong when it came to our Central America strategy, is it had 3 components. It had the governance component, the economic component, helping to address inequality and poverty, and then the security component. And most of the security component went to strengthening the police. And as far as the defense piece of the security component, it went to defense institution building. So reforming the defense ministries to not only increase military effectiveness, but also the transparency and accountability of defense institutions. And I would say really quickly that that's something that Chile is helping us with in Central America, and Mexico is as well.
Thank you, Rebecca. Stephen, since you touched on Colombia before, Londoño, the head of the FARC, the leader of the FARC, is running for the presidency, Timochenko. Do you see any possibility that he will win? And even if he doesn't win, if he gets like a big share of power, what would be the consequences, both internal and especially with Venezuela? In the peace process, of course.
I'm going to preface this with the familiar phrase, si no me equivoco. if I'm not mistaken, I believe that the special peace jurisdictions, that process has to get started to determine whether or not he's even fit to be a candidate, given responsibility for crimes committed by the FARC. So far, unless something's happened within the last 15 minutes, I think that the enabling laws are still stalled in the Colombian Senate. There's been a pronouncement on the part of the Supreme Court in Colombia that has said that the special peace jurisdictions can go ahead, which include Truth Commission, but they also include a series of special courts that will try various members of the guerrillas and determine whether or not they can actually participate in the political process. So that's out. One thing that I'd want to go back to, though, is that, observers that would say something like calling Mexico a failed state. Mexico's got really pretty robust democratic institutions. It's got a functioning Congress, Senate, and Chamber of Deputies. It's got state governments that actually work. You don't find departmental governments in many other Latin American countries that exist in much more than name only, and it does have local municipal governments. And since the end of the Calderon administration in 2012, there has been this pacto between the three main parties that brought in a number of institutional reforms. These reforms have not had a chance to take place, but they kind of highlight one of the problems. And Rebecca talked about defense institution reform, you know, stronger civilian-led defense ministries, which we've all worked with, and that was part of our portfolios. But the same kinds of reforms have been needed to strengthen public institutions in other areas, specifically in Mexico's case, the justice system, which has switched over and is still switching over. They failed to complete it on time, the conversion to the oral accusatorial trials, which will make that system function much more faster and much more efficiently, and enable plea bargaining and things like that, which will help process cases. The other thing, though, is to involve citizens more in the policies that affect them. And one of the things that my organization does is working on citizen security is to help municipalities work with citizen commissions to design the security policies and work with police. And most police in Latin America are nationally controlled. In Mexico, it's kind of a hodgepodge, but there's never been a sense of public ownership or citizen ownership of any of these institutions, and that's got to be essential for Mexico to move ahead. We talk about things that happen in our country, like Ferguson. We talk about policing in other towns, and we get very interested in looking into ways that things can be reformed and pushing things like community policing and that kind of thing. That doesn't happen very often in Latin America, and it really needs to, because citizens need to be much more involved in the policies that affect them.
But regarding Colombia, what kind of challenges do you see when the FARC gets more share of power? Regardless of the positions that they get, they're going to get more power because they're going to run for the elections, or they're going to get seats in the parliament. After a war with them,
well, they do have some guaranteed seats, a certain number of seats in the Congress, and so for 2 periods, 2 electoral periods, they'll be able to run for these safe seats, and then they have to compete out in the open. Whether or not they are able to conquer the public relations challenge of becoming popular to the Colombian public that has a very negative view of them remains to be seen. But I don't think the FARC should be underestimated. The extent of their financial holdings is not well understood, not well known, despite what they say and what their declarations are. And the other thing is that the European Union just took them off their terrorist list, which means that they could theoretically have access to credit, and they could go raise funds in European countries and increase their coffers. And they're very, as I say, they're very well organized. And they're competing in post-conflict zones, and kind of the worry is that these are rural zones where if you, I'm sure Roger, you and Rebecca, you have talked to people in Colombia, they tend to think of kind of Bogota as the center of the universe, and everything else in the territories is sort of like another planet. And the fact that the country isn't well integrated this way presents a problem, because the FARC could very well easily hold sway in these post-conflict areas, and Colombia is a big country.
Roger, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to make a very brief comment on the things you said, because everything I agree again with everything, but I do want to point out. First, I object to the term peace process, because it prejudges the outcome. It was a negotiation. The real peace process was when the Colombian military and national police with the overwhelming support of the Colombian people, absolutely smashed the FARC and humiliated them and ridiculed them in the battlefield with the help of the United States. We're very proud of that. It was smart bombs, intelligence, squads of men going out into the jungle, and dedicated work, and the support of the Colombian people that was the real process. Everything else, including the Nobel Peace Prize, is a little cherry on the top of this cake. So I never use the term peace process with regard to Colombia. It rewards the wrong people. Mexico is the country that should keep us all up at night. Our destiny, that of the United States and that of Mexico, is connected in ways that not 1 in a million Americans, myself included, can understand. And for the benefit of our guests from Latin America, I just want to give you a little tiny vignette from history, but it'll serve the purpose of my illustration. One of the 3 great works of literature of the United States of the 19th century were Huckleberry Finn, Moby Dick, but also the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. It's one of the great monuments of the English language. And in that book, President Grant, who served in the Mexican-American War, said the war against Mexico was the most unjust war ever fought by a strong nation against a weaker one. And he had a very strong sense of righteousness and divine retribution, Grant. And he said the punishment to the American people for the Mexican War was the Civil War. And people have forgotten this, but there was an absolutely direct connection between the Mexican-American War and the United States Civil War. Because, as Grant said, the Mexican War was a war thought up by Southern politicians, fought by Southern generals for Southern interests, to bolster the slave-holding states. And there was a direct line from the territories that were acquired in that war, which upset the compromise that had held our country together from independence on slavery. So we are connected in ways that may seem mysterious, but they are very real. The events that are roiling our politics now on immigration are in many ways due to things that happened or did not happen 30 years ago. So we have to get Mexico right. We have to get Mexico right, and we do not get it right by insulting Mexico, by keeping them at a distance, I don't need to go down the list. To me, one of the supreme ironies that people will look back on 30 years from now, and that makes my blood boil, is to see that in the same week that the 19th Chinese Party, Communist Party Congress established as one of its top 5 priorities the expansion of China in Latin America, this administration basically drove a stake into the heart of both Canada and Mexico with NAFTA. This will be looked back on as one of the great errors in history. So Mexico must keep us all awake. Sorry, I just had to get that off my chest. You had a question that you wanted to ask.
Yes, but I think that Rebecca has a follow-up.
Just really quickly, and I think when you asked me what should we do, and I mentioned NAFTA, I think the other thing we have to do is stop the toxic rhetoric. It really has an impact. And an example of this would be when Secretary Mattis, we have the first SecDef to go to the Mexican Independence Day celebrations, Grito. As he's flying to Mexico, it hits the press, the words that came out of the White House about how Mexico, and this is this term or this idea that Mexico is a failed state or a narco state is just, I think it's ludicrous. But that hit the Mexican press. I believe it was General Kelly, who's a very good friend of mine, but I believe it was he who referred to Mexico as a narco state. And so here you have Secretary Mattis going to Mexico to talk about equal partnership, and instead he has to shift into damage control because of those words. So words matter, and I really think we need to be careful when it comes to that.
Thank you, Roger. The question was, is the growing presence of China in Latin America a geostrategic threat for the United States? And also, that's for all the panel, is Russia increasing their presence in Latin America? Cuba, we hear Cuba, we heard before Nicaragua, we heard Venezuela. Is that true or not?
I had made some prepared remarks before I realized that we were doing a panel, and I was trying to set this in the broader context of the great forces that, if you are my age, I was born in 1963, that shaped our world. And to me, the great political forces, there are other, economic, whatever, but they are the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of China, the rise of radical Islam, and the most poorly understood of all, decolonization. Most people have forgotten that this actually happened. We just had this week one little extra reverberation of decolonization with the fall of Robert Mugabe. I mean, and that is still with us. And part of this, of the American stance towards Latin America, which is now a more hands-off stance, owes to this decolonization. So the question is, really, what is our perception of attempts by others to gain a sphere of influence in our region? Let me just dismiss Russia immediately. Russia is nothing. It's a scavenger power. It's like being worried about Italy, okay? It's not, except in our domestic politics now, Russia is just a scavenger. China is far more interesting. I am proud to say that when I was at Defense, I launched the first joint interagency PCC, you'll know what that is, on China in the Western Hemisphere, where we brought all the agencies together to talk about China. My takeaway from that was exercise, was truly that we can absolutely work with China if we explain to China what our concerns are, and we boiled it down to, we just want to have a level playing field. That's all. We want China to compete by the same rules we compete by. We want you, China, to honor your contracts. That was basically it. China listens. To draw from another part of the world, Africa, I look at Africa and I see tremendous opportunity. I believe the United States is incredibly competitive in Africa. And I think a world in which China and the United States, and hopefully India, are competing in China is going to be a much better world for everybody. I'm very optimistic about that.
What about China in Latin America?
It's as I said, as long as we are competing by the same rules, I don't have a problem with that. The problem with China is that it doesn't. And I don't need to go into it right now, but let me put some context into that. One of the first things I did when I got to the Pentagon was I said, let's just try to get our best minds together and see what we think a U.S. strategy for Western Hemisphere should be for the next 50 years, just as a thought exercise. So I went to the secretary and he said, oh, well, go see Andy Marshall. And who is Andy Marshall? For our distinguished guests, and if you have seen the movie Star Wars, then you know Yoda. Yoda is Andy Marshall. He has worked for every Secretary of Defense since there was a Secretary of Defense. I believe he's 101 years old. You know. He's still working. To see him, you go down through these swamps with mists and over the water into the basement of the Pentagon, and he is there, and he has lots of hair on his ears, and he goes like this. And I said, Mr. Marshall, let me give an idea of what Mr. Marshall is like. He is generally credited with having come up with the concept of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was to create a system of weapons in space that was so advanced and so expensive that the Soviet Union would be bankrupted by trying to compete with it, that they would realize this and that they would fold their hand, their gigantic communist bluff, which they did, of course. So I went to Mr. Marshall and I said, well, listen, I'm writing this 50-year strategy on Western Hemisphere. What should be in it? And he thought a long time. I mean a long time. If you, a Western Hemisphere strategy, seek, must you consider that the United States should not take for granted its presence in Eurasia. A long-term U.S. strategy cannot take for granted the idea that the United States will have a presence in Eurasia. What does this mean? We know that in Europe there's NATO and there's the EU and there's this and that and the other. There's structures in Europe. In Asia there's nothing like that, quite the contrary. It's the Hobbesian world of each for himself. Who knows what's going to happen in Korea next week? We don't know. We just don't know. Nobody knows. And if they tell you that they know, they don't know. And it may well be that the United States, a year from now, is the power that has lost in Asia. It may be that 5 years from now. It may be that 20 years. It may not be, but it may be. But in that world with that kind of uncertainty, the Western Hemisphere becomes again supremely important to us as our eternal bastion of liberty in the world. The Western Hemisphere regains its traditional strategic importance to us. The man who said it best was Elihu Root, who was Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of State. And after the Spanish-American War, it was a little bit like that. Roosevelt told Root, well, we have this empire now, we need a strategy. The empire came first, and then came the strategy. And Root said, the strategy of the United States should be that we need, I think the actual word he used was stability in the Americas, so stability in the Western Hemisphere, so that we can balance our interests in Asia and Europe. And if you think about it, that is what has guided us ever since. Ever since. That is why when Japan attacked us in the Pacific, we declared war on Germany. You know, this sort of thing. It all becomes clear with that. So I am not afraid of China. I think we can deal with them. They're one of the great civilizations. I think a world in which we are fairly competing with them and with India will be a better world. One last postscript on that. I would put my money on India. And certainly on India as our friend and partner and ally. And it was interesting to see that even so dense an administration as this one is recognizing things by calling it the Indo-Pacific Partnership. This idea has been around for quite a while, actually, through several administrations, but it's really sinking in. Otto von Bismarck once said that the most important fact of the 20th century would be that the United States and Great Britain spoke the same language. And I think he was right about that. I say that perhaps the most important fact of the 21st century would be that the United States and India share the same official language.
Okay, thank you. Stephen and Rebecca, I don't know if you have any thoughts about the increasing presence of China, or this is just a part of economics that they will expand.
Well, China, in the days of Mao and then shortly thereafter, China was not considered a power that would have very much influence in the Western Hemisphere. But after Deng Xiaoping and China's opening to the West and beginning to become competitive in trade, it soon became apparent that there were certain advantages, economic advantages that China had. Huge population, very low cost of labor. So if you're working in a battery plant and you don't have any occupational safety measures and you're getting a quarter an hour, obviously you're able to make batteries at a very low cost, even though you might fall in a vat of acid and nobody would ever question whatever happened to you. That's kind of the basis of the economic engine that got China started, and now it's on a very different trajectory with the growth of a middle class and things of that nature. The problem still, though, is that China is very competitive, and it seeks advantage in different countries of the world, especially in underdeveloped nations, where they can come in, they can do development. It looks good, but the labor and the companies that actually do the development are Chinese, and so they're really kind of helping themselves and getting access to commodities and things that they need for their own industry at home. I don't think, Roger says he wouldn't fault the Chinese and he's not afraid of them. They're looking after their own interests. The problem for the United States is that it needs to look out after its own interests, and specifically in areas where China would like to become more dominant in this hemisphere in particular. And how might we do that? Well, one thing, it's very easy for a country that's led by a dictatorship to strike all kinds of deals, economic deals, loans, give loans, do business partnerships and things of that nature. Even I'm not suggesting that they're written on the back of an envelope or a napkin, but they're much more easy to do than what we do. And Latin Americans call us detallistas, because we have many strings attached to the things that the deals that we create with our partners, and just try to get something past the CFIUS committee, that details some kind of radio or piece of avionics that's going into a fighter that we might export, and that goes to a certain country. There's all kinds of different certifications that have to happen, and the wheels of that bureaucracy move with great care and slowness. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong. I think that we try to be responsible to ourselves, that we don't shoot ourselves in the foot by giving away stuff that we shouldn't. But what happens is that the Chinese come in and clean our clock on making deals with countries in our hemisphere, and they have a very long trajectory in their time frame. They look at things in historical terms, and like it or not, and it's been said 1,000 times, and I'll say it again, they have a 3,500-year-old civilization, and they tend to focus things with the long view, and we don't necessarily do that. And certainly our corporate strategies aren't geared toward that. Our corporate strategies are more like what happens, what are the profits in the next quarter. So we don't do that. What we can do, though, I think, to minimize some of those risks of China becoming more dominant, is to continue to engage and to, in places where we can, simplify our engagement with our partners in the hemisphere, to make dealing with us a little bit more simple and palatable. In other words, it's to take something from things that every good businessman knows, make it simple and make it a pleasant experience dealing with us in basic marketing. Can we do that? If we put our minds to it, we could.
Thank you. Rebecca? Okay. Let me ask you a specific question then. President Putin has made a priority the fight against MS-13. These transnational crime organizations, how big of a threat is this for especially smaller countries? I'm sure that Roger, being from Central America, can give a lot of input to that, to smaller countries in Latin America.
I mean, I think it's, I remain very concerned about the Northern Triangle of Latin America because of MS-13 and of course the cartels, like the high levels of citizen insecurity. The last time I went to El Salvador, I was planning to stay in a hotel downtown, but our ambassador had me stay at her house instead, because there had been the MS-13 had thrown like a grenade into that. There was nothing tragic happened in that case, but it's palpable, the fear in the lives of Salvadorans, and I'm sure everyone's watching very closely. But the other, while I was there, it was another just sort of reminder at how dangerous life is in El Salvador. There had been, the MS-13 had ordered the the bus drivers not to go to work that day. Just all the bus services shut down. And I think that 3 or 4 bus drivers decided that they were going to go ahead and go do their routes, and they were executed. So like the city was basically shut down. These are really scary. It's a very scary situation, and I think just the ruthlessness of the gangs is something. It remains a threat. And in fact, if we're thinking about potential headaches becoming migraines, I mean, I think the Northern Triangle remains a challenge just because of this violence. But I think as far as what we can do to support these countries, and again, I think it has to be a multifaceted approach, and it has to be a long-term approach. It's not something that we're going to solve overnight, and that's why I think it has to be address this triple threat of weak institutions, poor governance, the economic challenges, and of course the security challenges. And institution building, again, doesn't happen overnight. So I think it's going to require a long-term commitment, bipartisan commitment. So it's not. I would say it's not a simple solution, but we need to continue to pay attention.
Thank you.
Pablo, if I might, could I just do a shout out to members of Congress, and we've had 2 members that have been here today, but just to compliment them. You know, as Roger pointed out, on Central America and Latin America in general in the 1980s, there was a lot of conflict and contention, and there wasn't an awful lot of bipartisan agreement on where policies should go. It was very conflictive. That started to change in the 1990s, and now in our Congress you see quite a bit of agreement and cooperation on both sides of the aisle on what the policies should be. And they've been, you know, in my opinion, you know, I'm not speaking for my organization, I'm just, you know, my own particular opinion in this is that they've been extremely responsible and responsive to the needs of the region, and traveling as they do, and through their interparliamentary unions and their House Democracy Partnership trips and the Institute for Representational Government that goes down to the region periodically. They've been very engaged and knowledgeable about what's happening in the hemisphere. So just wanted to make a shout out to them and call them out in a good way for what they've done.
Thank you. Roger, what's your take on the, not necessarily the MS-13, but these transnational crime organizations?
And the gangs. You know.
Yes, with smaller countries like Guatemala or El Salvador. Are they a threat to the security of the country?
Well, with regard to the gangs, I think the best person we could ask is a former gang member right here, our host, Joseph Humeyer. I'm going to steal your story. Who grew up in Virginia, and correct me wherever I'm wrong, was in a gang, a good one, right? A good gang. It wasn't MS-13. No, it wasn't MS. Well, yeah, I know, but we can't all join MS-13. So, anyhow, but Joseph said something that has always stuck with me. He said, you know, some of my friends are dead, some went to jail. I joined the Marine Corps. Joseph, thank you for your service. And he said something that is so extraordinarily profound and interesting. He said, you know, in my gang, the values were loyalty, manhood, courage, etc.
I was in the Marine Corps, right?
Well, this is the... Right. He said, I joined the Marines. Same values, different gang. Same values, different gang. Now that's overstating it. Did I mangle the story?
No. People used to tell me, I'm glad you're different. And I used to say, I'm not, I don't consider myself different. People that knew me when I was a kid know me today, know that I'm not that different. What changes in me, what changes the institution that I belong to. Make the point that institutions do matter.
So the most important battlefield is in here, and then those institutions. And just to dispatch the question of the gangs, in 2001, even before 9/11, that was one of my top concerns. The gangs domestically in the United States, and even though it's not a Defense Department issue, I was worried that somehow they would establish links with terrorists of different, Muslim terrorists, or Islamic terrorists, excuse me, the FARC, whoever, right? And I found an assistant something or other at the FBI who was interested in this question. And we studied it, and we could not get anyone in the government interested in this problem. And the truth is, it never happened. They did not get together. And I've always wondered, why was that? And I don't have a good explanation. If there's any future PhD in here, please take this up as your subject. What I do worry about is that this battle is not over, and in Central America you have these enormous disaffected prison populations. And that is a notorious place to preach, to make converts, and so on. When you look at the Northern Triangle of Central America, and Guatemala, and parts of Honduras, and so forth, the demographics are exactly the same as they are in places like Yemen, in the Horn of Africa. So there is that pressure, that possibility is still there.
Thank you. We have, I think, 3 minutes. So if you can wrap up with 1 minute of final thoughts, please. I know it's a very short time, but I think it's time for the next panel. Each one. Rebecca, please.
Oh, so I will just end again just by thanking you, Pablo. It was a pleasure to work with you. And again, I just wanted to thank Alex again. But the Western Hemisphere, and I hope, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to call out the importance of the Western Hemisphere, because I agree with Joseph's thesis that guides this conference, that this is a region, Latin America and the Caribbean, that we must pay closer attention to.
I would certainly agree with that. I want to thank all the members of the audience and people that came and showed up today for their interest and also their expertise, because I know that looking out here, I see various colleagues and people that I've worked with in various iterations in the past, and all have made their contributions in the area of defense or diplomacy or economics in different ways, and certainly your continuing interest in this issue is extremely important. And it's something where we need to, I think if there is something that where Joseph really deserves an awful lot of credit for doing, is taking this to a new generation, because we look on the Hill, we look elsewhere in town, there aren't too many people that have all their hair, no offense, Alex, and that it still has some color in it, that may be experts in Latin America, and we really need to bring in a new generation and help them take the reins of this and become experts in their own right to carry these relationships forward.
Roger.
I promised JD, where is he? Oh, there. I promised JD that I would try to commit a little bit of news. We were colleagues at the Pentagon, and his job in the press office was to make sure I did not commit news, but it was a difficult job. And I see we have a reporter from NHK. Konnichiwa. Well, there we have the media. I read, you may not believe me when I say it, but it's true. I read NHK every day. It is a fantastic outlet. Thank you for your work. So I want to pick up on what I think is going to be the most acute crisis we're going to face in the very near term, and for which we are not mentally prepared, and that is Venezuela. I don't believe that a dire economic panorama necessarily leads to the collapse of a regime. To the contrary, I think there's lots of evidence that keeping the people starved and worried about where their next bite is coming from is a very effective tool for regimes. I think it is time for us to think of how we are going to help the Venezuelan people when they decide it is time to change this regime by the use of force. What shape that force will take, I don't know. Whether it is army officers overthrowing the regime, whether it's the next generation of Venezuelan leaders realizing that the current leadership of the opposition has run its course and is exhausted, when it is our leaders and people in the hemisphere who are responsible for hemispheric relations realize that we have a 20-year policy of complete and absolute failure in terms of trying to change the behavior of the Venezuelan regime, to make them a responsible nation in the Americas. All that has failed. It's not a complete failure. I think that the efforts of the people who have gone the last mile, and then the mile after the last mile, and then the last inch after the last mile, to find a negotiated solution in Venezuela, negotiated, I didn't say peace process. I think what those efforts showed, and from colleagues of ours, such as Tom Shannon and John Maisto and so forth, men that I respect, I think they showed, much as the efforts of President Pastrana in Colombia showed, that these are not people that we can live with or negotiate with. They will only be changed, and I hope overthrown by force. Venezuela. So what are we going to do? We need to be prepared for this. We need to decide how and when, and it's up to the Venezuelan people to take this course of action. But it's coming. It will happen. And we can either be complicit with the regime and just ignore them or drop them or let them drift along. I would argue that the true accomplices of the regime are the people who have tried to extend a fruitless process of negotiation and political interaction, that they are now accomplices and enablers of this stinking regime. It is time for it to go. I encourage everyone here in this room who is inclined to think this way to see how can we help a new generation of the Venezuelan opposition. But the change will not come along by peaceful means. The president of the OAS said Venezuela is not a democracy. They do not have the right to choose their own future right now. They do not have it. The core of our strategy in the United States is to help the Latin Americans be able to choose their own future. We have reached the end of this road. What comes next, I think, will depend a lot on what many of the people in this room think and do. So thank you for the privilege to speak with you today. And I thank you to our hosts and our sponsors. This was a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for your great insight. Thank you.